Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is our daily newsflash guest expert, Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
So today we have a number of issues on the news, but particularly in the Middle East, violence is once more surging as the deaths of two Israeli victims of stabbing by Palestinians are met with Israeli force. One of the Israeli victims was a West Bank settler, while the other was a 20-year-old Israeli soldier. Now, Israeli troops did shoot and kill a 21-year-old Palestinian man in Hebron, where one of the attackers is from. Overall, Israel has increased its military presence in the West Bank. The tensions are mounting in the wake of an escalation of clashes in East Jerusalem, prompted by Israel's provocation around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is considered one of the holiest sites to Muslims around the world. Many commentators and even officials are expressing fears of a third Palestinian intifada. Well, Bob, how do you put these fears of another Palestinian uprising into context? And when the papers report them, we lose not only historical context of the occupation, but also we forget about the events of just this summer.
Yes. You know, it's interesting that there's not more violence in Palestine. That's what always amazes me. Not that there is violence, but there's not more. Sometimes I ask my students to imagine being occupied by Oklahoma and how they would react after decades of this. But what we really see here is this constant invocation by Israel that, in a sense, the Palestinians must be more morally righteous than Israel is, because of course Israeli settlers engage in this kind of violence. The Israeli army engages in massive violence, and the expectation is that Palestinians will not respond, especially after, as you're pointing out, this history of occupation. It's kind of inverted. The whole moral conversation in the Middle East, especially in Israel-Palestine, is often inverted like this. And as you point out, if one doesn't know the history, how these events came to be, then it's very easy to really lose touch with reality, quite frankly.
Speaking of the occupied territories, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has just named a retired Dutch general named Patrick Kamerhe to head a 5-person panel investigating Israeli war crimes aimed at UN facilities during the latest Gaza war. Ban decried the extensive damage that he witnessed during a recent tour of the area as, quote, beyond description. A separate UN Human Rights Council investigation is also underway. Meanwhile, the UN is also looking into human rights violations by the United States. This week, a panel of the UN Committee Against Torture in Geneva will investigate the widespread practice of solitary confinement in U.S. prisons. About 80,000 of the 2 million incarcerated American prisoners are confined at any given time, some for years and even decades. The experience is considered tantamount to torture. Now, Bob, are these UN investigations a good reminder that the U.S. has no moral high ground over Israel?
Moral high ground is hard to find when you're a nation state, and of course there is none here. It's interesting, Ban Ki-moon's statement, because of course the UN Secretary General, not only him, but all prior ones, have always been very hesitant to critique either Israel or U.S. practices. In fact, that's a pretty guaranteed way out the door if you are too critical. So I think that's an important statement, even though it's fairly muted. You described the solitary confinement as tantamount to torture, but I think it's appropriate to describe it as torture. And as these reports point out, it's used systematically. Occasional solitary confinement in extreme circumstances might be justified, but not in the systematic way that it's used. And it reminds us that in a lot of ways, U.S. prisons often really mimic third world conditions. Here in Texas, for instance, the lack of appropriate ventilation and air conditioning has meant that people have died in jail from heat exhaustion and heat stroke.
Right.
That's just impossible to imagine.
And finally, today is Veterans Day. President Barack Obama, in his proclamation, called on Americans to, quote, recognize the valor and sacrifice of our veterans and to, quote, participate in patriotic activities in their communities. Now, President Obama made no mention of the veterans of recent wars who have come home to denounce war altogether. One such person was 34-year-old Thomas Young, who was paralyzed during his deployment to Iraq and became an anti-war activist. Young died this past Monday of unknown causes. Obama also did not mention the many Latino immigrant veterans who have served in the U.S. Army and been deported. There are vigils planned in many U.S. cities today, as well as in Mexico, where some deported vets are, to commemorate their service and call on Obama to stop deporting them. Now, Bob, as a progressive, how do you approach a Veterans Day and the sort of conventional patriotism that infects it?
Well, as many of us have often said, we have to be able to separate the policies from the people who execute the policies. You know, we may object to the practices of ExxonMobil, but it doesn't mean we condemn everybody who works in a job at ExxonMobil. And I think the same principle applies here. We critique the policies that take the United States into war, but that's not a critique of the individuals. So on Veterans Day, I try to use the day to actually refocus attention on the policymakers. And we can all honor people's sacrifice, not only the service people in the U.S., but of course around the world, anywhere where people take those risks. But the focus is on the politics.
Right. Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.